Hello, I'm Dr. Stanley Sandler. This is the program Stan the History Man, and I'm centering around, if I may, my book, The Korean War, No Victors, No Vanquished. I think that maybe summarizes the war itself. So got up to the last time I talked to you, we got up to MacArthur's Incheon landing. The great surprise. It was uh, actually Kim Il Sung warned Mao Zedong. No, Mao Zedong warned Kim Il Sung the Americans might land there. And said, that's ridiculous. The tides are like 15, 20 feet. I mean, I sometimes wonder if the Koreans must have been hard up for ports to use something like Incheon as a port for their capital city. But anyway, that's the way it was. So a naval, marine, air force, a tripartite UN force descended uh, upon the port of Incheon, caught the North Koreans flat-footed, and exactly the casualty was very light. As a matter of fact, one American lost his life in the Incheon landing. His name was Lieutenant Svensson, Swenson, and he was killed when North Korean, what was left of the North Korean Air Force, dropped a bomb on the USS Svensson destroyer. Aha, you think that's a coincidence? Well, as a matter of fact, I'm sure I know the Miss Svensson, Lieutenant Svensson, was named after the ship was named after his father, and I'm sure maybe he pulled a few strings or whatever to get on board. But he would have bad luck to be the one American killed in the landing on Incheon. When they got ashore, there was tougher fighting at shore, the Marines against the North Koreans, but still the North Koreans were handicapped by the fact that they were facing the wrong way. They were looking south towards the Pusan perimeter rather than to the west where the Incheon landing took place. The Marines fought their way through Seoul, and there are a lot of combat footage taken at that time. And the Marines don't like to have a lot of publicity, which is fine. I mean, they're a great outfit, and they smashed their way through Seoul and then north of Seoul and kept on going. At the time, MacArthur also put on his X Corps, which was a whole Army corps alongside the Eighth Army, and that caused a lot of administrative crossing of wires and supply lines and so on. It's not considered one of MacArthur's brighter ideas. Nonetheless, the two UN armies, plus, of course, South Korean forces, an increasing number of soldiers from other 16 United Nations countries fought on our side by the end of the war. And the first ones are starting to come as some Brits, French, Dutch, let's see, Canadians were fighting on the UN or the American side, however you want to put it. So they moved northward, kind of romped northward. The North Korean army really fell apart. We talk about the American, we bugged out in Korea. Well, so did they. I mean, it was massive bug out on their side. I think what it was, they talk about the rigorous, and it was discipline, savage discipline. That was in the most communist armies in the North Korean army, but it was kind of a brittle discipline. Once they saw Allied forces or UN forces, whatever you want to call them, attacking them, behind and maybe behind them, from the Incheon landing, they didn't know what to do because the commissars were always telling them, "Oh, they cowardly Americans, we got them on the run," and they're fighting for nothing but money on that side, and then of course we just fight for our communism in our country. They just didn't know what to do. And so large numbers were captured or POWs at this time. I think that brittle discipline was smashed because they've been lied to. And been told, we just keep pushing on and they'll run away from you. And so that went on right through to the north. The northern capital, Pyongyang, was taken. Again, some resistance, but not an awful lot. When the commissar tells you to fight, you better fight or else. But then he turns his back and you run away. There was a lot of that. And by this time, however, another question came up, and that is the question of how far do we go? Do we liberate all of North Korea or just a certain part? Maybe the narrow waist where we could establish a defense line. MacArthur saying, victory to the north, and the South Korean leader was saying the same thing, that we Puch-Chin, drive to the north and liberate all of our oppressed brothers in the north. And so this was debated in Congress and in the United Nations. And as a matter of fact, President Truman flew to Wake Island to meet MacArthur. and to discuss the what do we do with the Chinese. And MacArthur said, if they come in this war, there'll be the greatest slaughter. Not to worry, Mr. President. And it was kind of a slapdash conference. There was hardly any minutes taken, so we hardly know what they were saying. But it was pretty obvious. MacArthur said, not to worry, it's over. And we'll be home by Christmas. And whenever they say home by Christmas, you can be pretty sure they won't be home by Christmas. So we went north and increasingly began to see Chinese troops in the field. We captured them, and they'd say, oh, I'm from this division, or I'm from that regiment. And now this is where intelligence is supposed to do its job. Who are these guys? How many of them are there? What's their morale? Whatever. But they didn't. You had these goose eggs drawn on the map of North Korea, which always Chinese here and maybe Chinese over there. That's not much in the way of intelligence. Meanwhile, 350,000 Chinese forces were being smuggled across the frozen Yalu River. Again, that savage communist discipline. If a Chinese soldier lit up a cigarette, he could be shot on the spot. So you don't light up anything. And his intelligence general Willoughby was kind of a courtier. He really, whatever Mark, yes, sir, General, you've got the right answer for everything. And that's exactly what an intelligence officer should not be. He should say, well, wait a minute, sir, I got some information here that indicates maybe the prevailing opinion isn't true or whatever. And soon more and more, then the Chinese in November 1950 smashed into the UN lines. The U.S. South Second Division was badly hit. It was trapped. They would knock out vehicles fore and aft in a narrow pass and then wipe them out. And what happened then was a sort of bug out fever. Everybody took off. And it's the longest retreat in American history, something like 800 miles from North Korea down to the north of South Korea. A slow, grinding retreat, which we lost all kinds of equipment and lots of men. It's a very dark period in our history. And this time now, this is in World War III. The Chinese are in. As a matter of fact, an American general met two Australian generals, they were coming in the war, and said, World War III has begun. And the Aussies were like, really? What? And well, the Chinese are in it now. And they didn't. They knew we had the bomb. Although Mao Zedong used to say, it's been fairly well authenticated, that the Americans want to drop a bomb on us. Okay, they'll kill several million of us, but we got lots of Chinese. They're all peasants spread out. It's not like hitting, Washington, D.C. or New York City. So go and bring on the bomb. Now, they didn't say that publicly, but that was kind of the attitude. And I think the attitude spread around that we can take it, a nation of peasants. And the battle lines, finally, we had to evacuate Seoul again. We firmed up south of Seoul. And because, again, the old story, their supply lines were getting long, our supply lines were getting shorter. And the American defense military that was really building up. The draft was reinstated. So we had the benefit of shorter supply lines. Now, at this time also, something else was happening, and that is the air war in Korea. Now, I said we had complete control of the air. But as we got up over the Chinese border, the Yalu River, then the communists sent in, mostly flown by Russian pilots, MiG-15s, which was something we knew almost nothing about. It was based upon a jet engine that I think the British developed it from the Germans. I'm not sure, but it was a British developed a Rolls-Royce. And that engine was sold to the Russians in 1947. Well, peace and love and everything. The Russians have been our great allies in the war. Even Stalin said, what fool would sell us his secrets? But the British said, here's we need the money. Well, Britain was broke after the war. So here you go. Do you need any more? And so around that superb British, how good British jet engines are. I mean, they're from Rolls-Royce, they're great. And around that engine, they developed the MiG-15, which was a very good fighter aircraft. It was on the parallel with our MiG, our F-85. And we didn't even have any F-85 over there at the time. We had just the kind of World War II design F-80. And even with the F-80, we were able to secure air superiority over them. And matter of fact, by the end of the war, it was a 12-to-1 ratio, allied to the communists. But it was kind of a shock in the beginning why they'd look at these. We had complete control of the air. Now, this fighting all took place over the Yalu River. Say, oh, we're restricted in Korea. We couldn't go right into China. Well, China couldn't come. Air power, at least, did not go south of the Yalu River. They made that very clear. As a matter of fact, I read pretty much original source where one MiG-15 was shot down. The pilot got out, and they strafed him because they wanted to keep that a secret that there were Soviets, Russian pilots of the MiG-15s. So there was limits on them. And again, not a single communist aircraft went south of the Yalu River. They had a couple of night intruders that raised all kinds of hell. They were almost like stick and paper. A radar went right through them, but they had bombs. They dropped them on our airfields. And several score, about through the end of the war, of good aircraft on our fields were destroyed on the ground. But that didn't have much effect on the war itself. The big fighting was to the north, and of course we sent the B-29 bombers to blast everything in North Korea. We reduced Pyongyang to a troglodyte city. Everybody's living underground, and also a lot of attacking of the bridges across the Yalu River, and that was quite an epic also. They didn't have smart bombs, and you had to dive in and get as close as you can and hit it. And of course, those bridges were vital to the communists, and so they were defended with anti-aircraft fire. One of the advantages we had, well, both sides had actually their air bases were close to the fighting. Our bases, maybe in South Korea and fighting North Korea, but the bases were also in Japan. And sometimes the pilot just had breakfast and then take off and bomb a bridge or something, drop a bomb over Pyongyang, and then drive home again for lunch. But so in the long run, they shot down more of our aircraft by ground fire because we were spending the whole time bombing these bridges and these railroad lines and so on, which were well defended. They had very good air defense, and but in the actual aircraft to aircraft, it was 12-to-1 MiG-15s over F-85s. So I think a lot of it, both planes are, you could argue one thing is one had a higher altitude, had faster speed, whatever. It was the pilots, these gung-ho kerosene cowboys. They really were killers. And I don't know if the Soviets had quite that sort of an appeal or not. But for the first time, you have jet-to-jet fighting. There were jet aircraft on both sides in World War II. Aha, you got that wrong. No, but they didn't fight each other. The Germans had the Me-262. The British had the Vampire, whatever. But they were in combat missions, but they did not tangle with each other. Well, by the time you have the stabilizing of the battle lines, then in July of 1951, the first anniversary of the war, the Soviet delegate in the UN said we should get together to discuss an end to the bloody war in Korea. And so we agreed to meet at the border between the lines, a town of Kaisan, and to negotiate the end of the war. And the communists were very helpful. They said, look, you come up here from the south, of course, because you're south of us, and put white flags on your Jeeps when you come to Kaisan. Yeah, well, white flag in the Jeep, they photographed that. That's always either surrendering. And also in Chinese tradition, the party from the south, that's the defeated party. The northern party is, you come on up and we'll grant you surrender terms. So that they finally got that one straightened out. But they figured, well, a couple of weeks negotiations, maybe a few months. I mean, the negotiations at Kaisan, then they moved to Panmunjom after Kaisan proved to be not a very good place for a conference, international conference, for 2 years. The armistice was signed on July 27th, 1953. I mean, the negotiations start in the spring of 1951. And there are all kinds of questions, of course, but the main thing was, what about the POWs? And we had hundreds of thousands of them, which we'd captured with that drive north. And they had, maybe 10,000 they captured in the early days of the war and so on. And of course, a lot of South Korean prisoners too. And the international law says when the war is over, at least the fighting stops, you exchange prisoners. We give them back ours, and I don't like the prisoner of war. Who's yours or whatever? It's better enemy prisoners of war, okay? And we had 22,000 enemy prisoners of war. And I mean, we have more than that. I don't know the exact number now, but 22,000 did not want to go back to the communist paradise. Well, the North Koreans said, well, standard international law. I mean, that's the law. You've got to send them back. And we remembered after World War II, we sent back a lot of people the Russians claimed were really Russians didn't want to go back, and a lot of them committed suicide before they go back. So we didn't want to do that again. And so on that question, the negotiations went on for almost 2 years. Now, what was also a lot of publicity then was 22 Americans didn't want to go back. I think one or two blokes didn't go back, and maybe one Frenchman. What is wrong with the youth of this country? 22 Americans didn't want to go back to America. And matter of fact, in the end, one died over there, I think, and all the rest of them were somehow allowed to come back. But it was supposedly a propaganda black eye. But you have to look at the figures. Far more. There was a war going on inside the POW camps on our side between pro-communist POWs and anti-communists, saying you better sign up for our side or their side. So it wasn't a completely free choice necessarily. And those who look upon all the Americans, in Korea who should have been there, they emphasize that. But there's no question about it. It was far more didn't want to go back. Now, to be fair, also, many of the Chinese prisoners of war were press gang from the Nationalist Army, and they'd been, defeated and didn't have an awful lot of enthusiasm for the communists. I should also point out that MacArthur, they talk about the long retreat to South, didn't take the Chinese very seriously. Say, wow, what's the matter with that guy anyway? Well, you look at the record, the Japanese basically could go where they wanted to go in Korea. I mean, they might face opposition here or there or whatever, but basically the nationalists, the communists spent more time fighting each other. So, and also, of course, the army had been defeated by the Japanese many years before. So the reputation of the Chinese army wasn't that great. Looking back, nowadays, the Chinese army, don't mess with them, but not in 1950. Okay, it's retrospective falsification. So MacArthur wasn't a total fool not to take the Chinese seriously, but he should have taken them more serious than he did. I mean, they still had a lot of people there. And as I said, he pushed his way back below the 38th parallel. So what happened then in April of 1951, MacArthur had been, right since the Chinese entered the war, even before, and we've got to roll. We got to just go across the Yalu River. That's where it's all starting. So please, let me get in there and go north of the Yalu River and into China itself, and take over some areas and whatever. And the Truman policy was containment. We don't want any more a third world war. We just want to contain the communists where there's aggression. And MacArthur, that's not that there was, victory is the only, there was no substitute for victory, as MacArthur said. So Truman abruptly fired him. And he came back to the States for the first time about 14 years. He had been over in the Orient all that time. And he came back, and to great just adoration. More ticker tape was thrown at him than Lindbergh back in 1927. And so he gave a message to Congress. And I heard it. And he said it ended with, he talked about how, we were losing so many chances to win this war against communism, how evil communism is. And he said, but, as for myself, we used to say at West Point, the barracks ballad, old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And like the old soldier that I am, I'll just go to my rest and just fade away. Well, there was a tremendous cheer for him, MacArthur's president. And so the convention, the summer of 1952, there was MacArthur. And everybody's waiting, MacArthur's speech. And he gave the most boring speech. I mean, I don't think I've known any line from it. People are going to out the door and everything, and that was the end of that. And so what eventually had the Republicans couldn't lose that year because they didn't get MacArthur. Well, they get Eisenhower. They got Eisenhower and won the election. So what happened was, I say, the battle lines were firmed up, and what you have are hardened. What you have a World War I situation where you have trenches, trench warfare, just like World War I on the Western Front in 1918. Trenches, barbed wires, Stokes mortars, heavy bombardments, uh, mass infantry offensives. Well, not mass compared to World War I, but still large scale. And just getting nowhere, basically. Operations, some of these forsaken places like Pork Chop Hill and so on, and just went on and on. And people got sick and tired of the war. The draft was in, boys were coming home in boxes, and for what? Are we going to liberate Korea? Well, no. And are we going to take on the Chinese? Well, no. And there was a great Red Scare at this time. A number, Alger Hiss, communist agent, the Rosenbergs, who actually executed for being spies. We used to do that in those days, well, only with the Rosenbergs, but still. And of course, we were told, oh, this is all just right-wing propaganda. And we know now that certainly the Rosenbergs and Hiss were guilty as Hades of espionage for the Soviet Union, actually going on before the Korean War, actually during World War II. But still, there was this panic, almost a panic. The Russians are coming, and we mass rebuilding of our military. They increased very much heavy draft calls. You had a pretty good reason not to have to go into the Army, although it's interesting, during the Korean War and during the Vietnam War, the massive American troops went to Germany, not to the Orient. Well, finally, they determined that India should interview these POWs and would probably get a fairly impartial view of where they stood, whether they wanted to go home or stay in the West. And finally, with that, the Indians gave the report, and they exchanged the POWs, both sides. And finally, both sides on July 27th, 1953, signed a armistice agreement. It's not a treaty. It's just an armistice agreement, like we're going to stop fighting. And the border between North and South Korea to this day is the battle line of the Korean War. Well, thank you for listening. Understand the History Man. Look forward to having you join me again. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.